Ready to cozy up your space this fall? Wisconsin Home Goods has just what you need. Hand-poured soy candles crafted in small batches, made to burn clean, and scented with the warm, comforting notes of the season. Stop by their shop at 4664 Cottage Grove Road on Madison's beautiful east side, or browse their fall collection online at wiscohomegoods.com. Shop local, breathe easy, feel good. All autumn long with Wisco Home Goods. Word to the wise, the cold always comes faster than you think. That's why Cardinal is rewarding the early birds. Book your furnace tune-up for just $119 if you do it by September 15th. After October 1st, it's $149. And trust me, you don't want to wait until then. A broken furnace isn't just inconvenient, it's chaos. Smart homeowners get ahead of it. Cardinal's the team Madison trusts to keep homes warm. Book online at cardinalservice.com or call 608-218-3895. This is CityCast Madison. I'm Bianca Martin, and here's what Madison's talking about. Today, proposals for new data centers are surging, but what happens when one gets planned near you? A Virginia-based data center company is looking to build a campus right here in Dane County, so we have to stay aware. Joining me to discuss the potential impacts of data centers and their growth in Wisconsin is Tom Content. Content is the executive director for the watchdog organization that represents utility customers here in Wisconsin, the Citizen Utility Board, or CUB. Hi, Tom.
Hi, good to be back with you.
Yeah, so great to see you. Really interested in getting into this topic. It feels like data centers are all the rage, but before we dive too deep, let's start with the basics. What is a data center?
So a data center is basically a giant warehouse, a very giant warehouse of computer servers that help tech companies make sure they store everything that's in the cloud. The thing everybody always talks about is cat videos, but everything that's in the cloud, whether it's the information we store, the apps that we use, it's all backed up to the cloud, right? There's computer equipment in there and servers that serve not only those data centers, but then the emerging aspect of data centers is with AI, artificial intelligence, and all the innovations and hype about AI. The amount of new data centers that we're seeing is in large part due to this infusion of excitement and investment to expand AI.
There's something about the cloud that felt like, oh, it's just this magical space so that we can have all this data, but there are actual infrastructure that's needed, physical infrastructure to keep this up. And as you said, AI, I mean, that's really a space that the data that's needed is infinite, right? And the amount of energy that's being used. So data centers are certainly what everyone's talking about nationwide and right here in Wisconsin. To give some examples, like there are proposals, they're actively being built here in our state. A new plant is underway in Beaver Dam in Dodge County. There's active plans for a facility in Port Washington in Ozaukee County, right by Lake Michigan. And as mentioned, a proposal for a plant right here in Dane County, plus more proposals near Milwaukee and Mount Pleasant and Kenosha. Tom, why is our state becoming such a hotbed for this kind of tech development?
Well, it's a hotbed because nearly every state is a hotbed. There are actually proposals for data centers around the country, and it's very intense. And one of the concerns we have is how many of these data center companies are actually going to open projects versus announce projects, because there's a huge forecast and a big pipeline of data centers, but how many of those actually get built is a big question. We're not as aggressive, or we're not seeing as many proposals as, say, some states like Virginia and Ohio. But just last week, there was another one announced for Western Wisconsin in Menominee, an entirely new project. It is real that it's taking the state by storm, because it's something that we in the utility industry and we as consumer advocates weren't talking about 2 years ago. And now it seems like it's all we're talking about.
Yeah, when I'm reading like 6 or 7 different names, it feels like the industry is gangbusters, but it's wild to think that some states are even experiencing this at a greater pace. But yeah, whether or not they do develop or not is also a question. What do we know about the proposed data center for Dane County?
Yeah, I mean, this one it would be 15 buildings and an investment of up to $500 million. would be expected for each building. So these things, if they happen, they get phased in over time. So it's not like we would see all that overnight necessarily. But it's interesting that they chose an area so close to Madison for this, given the property values here. So how much of the land acquisition costs are significant, I would think, versus some more rural parts of the state. But it's interesting that it's happening here too. I mean, we were ready for it, knowing that Microsoft was coming into Racine County because their construction towers were there pretty quickly after it got announced by the head of Microsoft, and President Biden was actually in this state for that announcement.
Yeah, it is really interesting that they're choosing Dane County. And from what I understand, and it's a proposal at the state, right?
Correct.
The proposal is for a 615-acre data center in rural Dane County, which is like rural for Dane County versus rural in other parts of the states is a different thing, in Vienna. And the power company would be Alliant Energy. And yeah, as you mentioned, looking at possibly building as much as 15 buildings, which could each cost more than $300 million to build. One of the bigger conversations here, too, is like these are companies that are not Wisconsin companies. So this one around Dane County is proposed by QTS, who has 75 data centers across the U.S. and Europe. So I don't know if we know anything about, the likelihood of this happening. Are they courting us? Are we courting them? I don't know if you have any of those details.
I don't have specific details on that. It's interesting to monitor this because some of the biggest names in the stock market, the Magnificent Seven stocks, are big proponents of data centers. And we're seeing that with the Beaver Dam project. We're seeing that with the Racine project. And then you have these other companies that aren't household names that are also involved. I see that, QTS is based in Virginia, and Virginia is really the kind of the mecca, if you will, or the ground zero, depending on your perspective, of data centers, because the fiber infrastructure in Washington, D.C. area is just so aggressively built up in terms of the internet background that's needed to support the federal government, that ended up being the spot that data centers really wanted to congregate before this became kind of a trend affecting dozens and dozens of states across the country.
Yeah, having lived in D.C. for a few years there, I can say the internet is very strong comparatively to Madison.
Right.
Let's turn to talk about impact here. High level, what are the positives of getting a data center in the area? We're just going to start there.
I mean, I think the biggest thing is the tax base that the community gets. The state has, in its budget a couple of years ago, passed tax incentives so the data center companies get a break on taxes of the actual equipment, the data center equipment. And so that's one of the reasons that Wisconsin is seeing an influx. And then on the economic development side of things, I mean, a lot of the economic development stories are about jobs, right? When you think back to the Foxconn proposal, the initial proposals there were 10,000 jobs, which never materialized. But usually it's a jobs question. And with data centers, it's a little different because there are construction jobs, just like with any project that has to be built, but those are temporary. The permanent jobs with data centers is a lot less than, say, if we were trying to attract a new electric vehicle factory to replace the Janesville plant that closed a few years ago.
Sure. Yeah. I saw reporting from WPR that the proposed Dane County data center could, quote, generate more than 1,000 construction jobs. But you're right. There's also the possibility you build the place and then how many jobs is that potentially AI center taking is something to consider.
Right. I mean, it's a high-tech industry, right? And it's about AI. And so when I think about high tech and AI, I'm thinking computers and robots in the future. So no, it's more in terms of there are certainly people on site to manage the thing, but it's a really equipment heavy operation.
Speaking about computers, I do want to talk about the costs because I know that you have a lot of information about that. You over at the utility board pay a lot of attention to energy usage in our state. These computers are going to need to be powered. Do you have any sense, Tom, how much energy these coming centers in Wisconsin are projected to need?
Well, really, this is where it's kind of off the charts, and the average person may not have thought about this yet, but it's orders of magnitude bigger than anything else that we've seen. This is why this is so transformational for the utility industry, actually. So if you think of, the Like over in Milwaukee, We Energy's largest customer today is a big factory, and they use about less than 100 megawatts of power. And a typical home uses well under one, it's a tiny fraction of 1 megawatt. And then these data centers can use 1,000 megawatts or 2,000 megawatts. There's even talk in Port Washington. There has been talk of whether the Port Washington one could be as big as 4,000 megawatts. So it's easily the largest single customers that we've seen in the state as far as the amount of energy each one would use. And if you take just the ones on the eastern side of the state, the Microsoft and Port Washington together, on the high end, that's about as much energy as all the 1 million customers of We Energies use today. So it's more than an entire city for one data center.
Holy smokes. That is quite the figure.
The power needs are so significant. Do the utilities have the infrastructure ready to meet them is a big question. And if they get built and they suddenly trip offline, what does that mean for the reliability of the power grid? That day is a question that we're asking. And then there's just making sure that Joe homeowner and Jane renter and Jade small business aren't seeing their rates go up because of these things.
What are you all's thinking at this point about how prepared Wisconsin's electric grid is for handling this kind of upped usage?
Well, We Energies proposed a new natural gas power plant in Oak Creek and another one in Kenosha County to support the expanded use from the Microsoft project.
Is that the equivalent to our Alliant Energy for the Milwaukee area?
Exactly. Milwaukee area and eastern Wisconsin, parts of eastern Wisconsin. So Alliant hasn't said exactly how they're going to meet these needs, but they did delay the retirement of one of their coal plants in Sheboygan and signaled that they might be looking at converting it to burn natural gas instead. And that was related to future economic development opportunities at the time that was announced. And then, of course, since then, there have been these economic development announcements in Alliant's case for Beaver Dam and for Dane County, Vienna.
You're mentioning that there would be this massive increase in how much Wisconsin's electric grid would be being used and kind of talking about the energy needs there. I do want to understand, would that be the main source of energy to fuel these is natural gas?
I think it's a mix because certainly solar power can get you a lot because solar power has come down in price so much. And actually, Alliant Energy, the utility we're talking about with this one in Dane County and Beaver Dam, has built a lot of solar, over 1,000 megawatts of solar just in the last few years in different projects across the state. But then there's the question of, what do you do when the sun's not shining? What do you do for wind power when that's not blowing? So it's going to be a mix, I think, is my expectation. There have been concerns raised about how much added fossil fuels Wisconsin could see as a result of data centers. And I think that's really an open question right now. And the other potential options are batteries, because there are now grid scale batteries that are giant versions of basically EV batteries that our utilities are actually installing next to their solar projects in some cases. That could be a backup. And we think it would be important for data center companies to think about, bringing some of their own generation, whether that's their own solar panels on the roof of the data center or their own battery backup, so that it's not the responsibility of the utility to provide every blessed electron, if you will.
Fall's about to be busy, y'all, and I'm getting on my grind. Working out in the AMs or truly whatever I can get them in. The one thing I wish I had more of is time, particularly in the mornings. Fortunately, Huel gets that too. Huel, spelled Huel, their Black Edition powder is a complete meal, so you feel full, focused, and ready for your day. I'm someone who spends so much time adding ingredients to my smoothies, and Huel cuts that prep down to almost nothing. At less than $3 per meal, it's packed with 40 grams of plant-based protein and 27 essential vitamins and minerals. And just when you thought Huel had everything covered, they just dropped a first-of-its-kind Super Greens drink in a can. This is your daily greens, 42 vitamins, minerals, and superfoods, only 25 calories, 4 grams of fiber, 1 gram of sugar, made by dietitians. Try Huel with 15% off for new customers today using our code Madison at Huel.com/Madison. Fuel your best performance with Huel today. You mentioned the possibility of seeing this trip up the electric grid. Could outages become more of an issue then? Do you have any sort of projections around that?
We don't have firm projections, but I know some of the concerns out in the Mid-Atlantic region, which is Virginia, Pennsylvania, Maryland, right now are about the reliability of the grid in a few years. And so they're seeing power prices in their power market spiking because of that. And we've seen some of those similar spikes here in the Midwest, and that due in part to all these expected surges in energy demand. So I think the utilities are responsible for keeping the lights on, and they're very focused on that. And we are urging them to maintain that focus even in the midst of this economic development gold mine of an opportunity that they may see here. That really, you got to stick to your knitting, and job one is keeping the lights on. And keeping bills for everybody affordable is right up there, too.
Yeah, on that note, what do we know about the possible impacts to our wallets in terms of how this will impact personal and local businesses' utility bills?
That's the tricky part, and that's where we've been watching what's going on in other states through our national network of consumer advocates and kind of trying to glean information about how our colleagues, the other consumer advocates, are approaching this for data center projects that have come before this. But what the utilities are saying is that, by and large, that the customers will be protected. In other words, the data center and tech companies are going to be paying their fair share. And so there are actually cases that have started, just getting started at the Public Service Commission right now, where that's being, kind of vetted. And so we're in those cases to make sure that there are sufficient consumer protections. The tech industry is evolving rapidly. And so if all of a sudden there's a new, much more energy efficient way to do a data center, do we need as many? Will some of these companies pull out and leave the state after we've just built all this new infrastructure, these new power lines, these new power plants to serve them? And so we want to make sure they're on the hook for whatever costs they're responsible for. And so really, it's a cliche, but the devil is in the details. And so that's why we have an economist, and our policy experts are actually reviewing the proposals really carefully on behalf of CUB.
Nothing is ever truer than that. The devil is in the details. And it sounds like, also offsetting any increases in prices that customers might have to shoulder, that would be them doing their fair share and just taking that into account so there isn't that much of a burden. Would you say, would it be clean cut? Or will utility consumers be seeing some kind of bump? Would it be fully offset?
I think it's impossible to say everything will be offset, just because, right now we're seeing waves of proposals for new power lines that are coming, kind of the really giant power lines, the interstate ones that are proposed to come through Wisconsin. And they're proposing ATC, Xcel, Dairyland. They're all part of a network of companies that maybe end up building much larger power lines along the interstates than we've ever seen before in Wisconsin, even bigger than the ones that have been controversial, like the one from Madison to Iowa that's been in the news in the last few years. It would be even bigger than that.
And that's big.
And that's big already. And so that's in large part due to data center growth throughout the upper Midwest. And then we are seeing, the market prices. So when every utility has to have a portion of our bill is the cost of the fuel at the given hour that we're using the electricity. And those prices are pushing up in part because of all this surge in growth that we're seeing.
I've also heard that when up and running, these facilities are going to take an immense amount of water to keep the computers cool. I know you're not an expert on water usage, but have you heard about those concerns? What have you heard?
It's a big issue, and it has been a big issue for data centers in some of the drier parts of the country. And as a Great Lakes region state, I think one of the reasons that we're seeing them is because of access to water. Having said that, I hope the technology is improving to the point where, through the Great Lakes Compact and improved technology, that these data center companies are able to use closed loop systems to the maximum extent possible, so that it's recirculated water instead of new water being used all the time. There are actually Wisconsin companies that actually are in the business of heating and cooling equipment. And so some of those are actually trying to make a play into the data center space to say, we're ready to serve you with technologies to cool your data centers. Because if you've ever been in a computer server room in an office building, it's kept very cold for a reason, because all that equipment heats up. And so that's part of the energy suck.
Yeah. I mean, I've been in a room where I have a laptop on me and my laptop heats up, and it starts making noises. So I certainly can imagine that times 1,000 or times a few thousand or however, You
could add a few zeros to that. Yeah, probably.
Yeah, add a few more zeros. It's heating, and so they need the cooling. Tom, I understand you're a national thought leader on this issue. You're a part of national conversations about data centers. We're talking about the water, and tech's fast expansion. With that, there's been an ongoing concern about federal regulators keeping up with tech's growth. And when it comes to water, I've seen a lot of headlines around an AI data center in Memphis, Elon Musk's center, that people are tying it to pollution surges in a historically Black Memphis community. So I know that there are issues around equity. Have you heard about, on the national level, people really being concerned about the impact of data centers and them possibly disproportionately impacting certain populations over others?
I think we're already in an affordability crisis nationally. And the National Group Powerlines put out a study just about a couple of months ago that showed that the rate of increases being sought by utilities just in 2025 is at a record high, and it's much higher than 2024. And that we're seeing that around the country. And a lot of that is even before the data center thing hits in full force. And so our national network of consumer advocates and regulators and utilities actually came up with a report that said that this trend should actually, and this was a conclusion, it should put downward pressure on people's bills and not upward pressure on people's bills. And that's something consumer advocates say all the time, but to have a group of utilities agree with us, we felt that was strong language in what could have been just wishy-washy compromise document. On the equity question, there's concerns about people who are struggling to pay their bills today and how that could be magnified if we don't get this right. So that's where our frame of reference is. And it also is coming at a time when Congress could zero out energy assistance funding for the poor, weatherization funding for the poor. Those are both on the table in Congress this month because they're part of the federal budget for the year that's supposed to start October 1. There's a lot going on at once, including with some of the federal initiatives that kind of intersect with this.
Yeah, there's so much to this picture, and it's coming at us so fast. So, as a citizen, I'm grateful for the board that you're on and the work that you're doing to be watchful and looking out for those of us who will bear the burden of these costs, depending on how this plays out. For folks who are listening, is there something people can do if they perhaps are or aren't excited about these possible upcoming realities? Like, is there someone folks should contact or a way to make their voice heard in this conversation as things gets decided that impact their lives?
Well, sure. I mean, that it's early in these cases that I talked about, but there's a case involving Alliant, and then there's going to be one involving We Energies. And at some point in that process, there would be an opportunity for the public to weigh in. And so public comments on the PSC website, Public Service Commission, which is the state agency that regulates the monopoly utilities, will have a public comment period, we expect. And so that's when customers can express their own concerns. And in the meantime, we represent all the customers in the state, so we're a nonprofit, so people could support us and support our work at cubwi.org. We actually have a data center page on our website as well, but then there's opportunities to support our work and our advocacy on behalf of Wisconsinites.
Tom, thank you so much for taking the time to inform us on this very important hot issue. Hot being the term. We're talking about the heat that's going to be needed for these data centers. I feel a lot more informed, and I'm sure you out there listening feel the same. Tom, thanks so much.
Oh, absolutely. Glad to do it.
That's Tom Content, Executive Director of the Citizens Utility Board of Wisconsin. That's all for today here on CityCast Madison. I'm your host, Bianca Martin. Don't forget, you can support the show and get great perks by becoming a CityCast Madison neighbor at membership.citycast.fm. And hey, if you enjoyed today's show, why not share this episode with someone who cares about the future viability of our electric grid? All right, we'll be back tomorrow morning with more stories from around the city. Until then, take good care.